All right. Hello again. I didn't give much of a background earlier, so I'll have Ben and I introduce ourselves before we get too far into this. I'm a lead research engineer at UL Fire Safety Research Institute for the last couple years, but I've been with UL since 2013. I was working with Ben for some years in Chicago on product safety. Before that, I was in the firefighting technology group at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And before that, I kind of got my start in all this actually up in this area. I'm originally from Newburyport, about 45 minutes north of here. Went to UMass Amherst, did the volunteer program out at Amherst Fire Department. I was on Engine 3. So that's kind of where I got the bug that bit me and made me realize I need to do this. So that kind of got me down to Maryland, working with NIST and their firefighter group. So it's been a fantastic ride since then. And every day is obviously very fun to work on firefighter issues. So let me turn it over to Ben.
Sure, thanks, Adam. So my name is Ben Gaudet, a lead R&D engineer working for UL Solutions outside Chicago. I'm originally actually from this area as well, but I've been working for UL outside of Chicago for about 6 years now. Mechanical engineer, fire protection engineer, and like Adam, I like solving fire problems. So here we are.
So we're going to cover one of several projects that we've run with the International Association of Firefighters. So this one actually, Sean DeCrane was our partner on this. We partnered with IAFF to get a grant from the Department of Energy to look at considerations for response to fires involving renewable energy technologies. So we specifically looked at residential energy storage systems. That's a freeze frame of a video that I'll show you in just a little bit. But first, I just wanted to run through a little bit of background, like why we chose to look at residential energy storage systems, some incidents that have occurred with them, what they taught us and helped us to set up for our project work. We'll talk about a couple projects. I'll talk about the first one where we were running some fire tests with batteries. Ben will talk about a follow-up that was actually funded by UL FSRI because we had some unanswered questions. So at UL Solutions in Ben's office, there's a engineer, Dr. Veronica Kimmerly, that maintains a database of information about lithium-ion battery failure incidents. Now, this is phenomenal work. It's hard work, and it provides a lot of value to us because basically what she did is she put together some programming tools and some web scraping tools which search the web every day, and in I think it's now 16 languages come back with incidents that have occurred since she last checked. She manually enters those into a database then and tracks all these incidents. So she's got thousands of entries, and in this world where NFIRS does not capture lithium-ion battery incidents, and yet we're seeing more and more incidents, we need to know what's going on. So her work can provide us a glimpse based on what the news reports, what governments are reporting. So this is global incidents, and the easy takeaway here is that as batteries roll out into more and more products, and frankly we're focusing on them more, we are seeing more and more incidents across all different types of products. So the three shown there are electric vehicles, energy storage, and consumer products. Consumer products is a pretty broad category. It captures your cell phones, tablets, laptops, power tools. We've created a whole map to try to identify which kinds of devices are failing the most. But you can see if you're responding to a battery incident, it's likely going to be a consumer product involved. It's likely going to be an ignition source, but as you get into energy storage and EV, it's a lot less likely. They tend to be designed to a much more rigorous set of standards, but the consequences may be higher. We'll get into some of that. So her data also shows that this is a global challenge. So last week, the United States Fire Administration held a inaugural event called the World Fire Congress. We had delegates from, I think, 56 different countries. It's either 53 or 56, but from all across the world. And one of the topics was emerging technologies, and batteries took over that conversation. What this chart is showing you here is the breakup of incidents around the world. Those blue circles pretty much represent just consumer products. So the world is seeing a lot of consumer product fires, followed by a little bit of electric vehicle fires, followed by energy storage systems. So last week we began conversations on, as the fire services from around the world, what are our common problems so we can start identifying common solutions. So first, I'll just mention a few deflagration and ESS incidents. This is obviously one of the biggest hazards. With energy storage, they've been mentioned multiple times today. Hunter did a fantastic job relating his own experience, but one of the greatest concerns is if batteries are going to be inside buildings, if they can release flammable gas, then we should reasonably expect to see some incidents. Now the good news is there hasn't been many. There's only been basically a handful of battery explosion incidents in residences in the world. In Germany, as of the end of last year, there was about 1 million installations of residential energy storage system units. They've been around in Germany for about 10 years. So that's where we've seen the most incidents. So the failure rate for them, based on the quality of those products, is still pretty low. But as you can see, the events can be pretty severe. Now, fortunately, they've happened where the batteries failed before the fire department gets there. So the deflagrations have blown out windows, blown off doors, lifted the roof and set it back down in some cases. And then there's some numbers here on the side that are going to be relevant in a minute. Into one of tomorrow's presentations, Sean traditionally references how far each fire was from Cleveland, because we know Cleveland is the center of the universe. So a couple field incidents that are sort of most relevant to our work. Now, they're not energy storage, but the fundamentals are the same. We expect a low failure rate, but we're putting both energy storage units inside garages and electric vehicles. We're going to see incidents like happened in Montreal, Canada, and Erie, Colorado, where in Montreal, Canada, there was a Hyundai Kona sitting at rest, not charging inside a garage. The batteries went into thermal runaway. The gas accumulated inside the garage, and the door blew off. And so that door was basically on the other side of the street by the time the fire department got there. In Erie, Colorado, we actually have a police body cam video of what happened. And I would be mistaken if I didn't reference how far each one is from Cleveland. So here's a look at Erie, Colorado. So now the incident commander, in that case the acting battalion chief, was standing in the driveway about 20 feet from that door. The door came off when there was a deflagration due to a buildup of battery gas inside. And now he didn't get injured, but that's obviously a very near miss. It actually knocked his helmet off. Put some small scratches in there, but had he been positioned slightly differently, the tables that Ben and I have, and just common sense tell you that that could have caused a severe injury, if not a fatality. And actually what's somewhat amazing to us is there were 3 firefighters in that garage when that deflagration occurred. So the pressure, very fortunately, wasn't high enough to cause him an injury. The fire that resulted was very minor because there's effectively nothing in this brand new garage other than the vehicle which started the incident. But it demonstrates that this is a new hazard. We didn't see anything from the outside that would have indicated that this was likely to occur. So since Sean clued me in that Cleveland's the center of the universe, I did my engineer thing, went ahead and put together a plot, which there's a little bit of speculation here from me on the severity of the incidents, but you'll notice that each incident, as it gets closer to Cleveland, becomes more serious. So this, unfortunately, the audio's not working, but we had anonymous tipster send us a video. At one of our own tests, someone from Cleveland was there, and you can hear his giggle. So for now, we just call him the Cleveland Giggler. Anyway, so what I want to pivot to is to talk about the risk of incidents that can occur. So I mentioned in Germany, there's 1 million installations, very low failure rate, but the failures we've seen looked fairly severe. So what we needed to do as part of this project with the Department of Energy is to understand how severe they can get. We can accept that the risk is low because we have codes and standards requiring minimum construction, requiring limitations on the quantities that can be involved. So if the vertical axis is frequency, how often something happens, and this horizontal axis is severity, where do we put energy storage systems? For the project, we're putting it about here. We can say across the globe, not many of these incidents have happened, but we need to better understand. We need to understand if those batteries are causing a catastrophic incident or if they're causing something that's a near miss like you saw in Colorado. And then what do we do about it? We can't just say, well, it's not that big a hazard, don't worry about it. So that's where we ran this project. And the objectives were to determine whether battery gas from something in failure can affect how a fire burns. So obviously we know that it can cause an explosion. But what happens to that fire if you have a room and contents fire and that battery product becomes involved? Does it change the way the fire burns? Can you even tell that that battery is involved in that fire? So we looked at US Census data, and we looked at where the code allows you to install different battery products. So for residential energy storage, you can have an attached two-car garage. Our basic look across where different installations are occurring is people are putting them in their attached two-car garage, because that's what most modern homeowners have in this country. If you look at the way tract homes have kind of exploded across the country with construction, and if you look at the sense of it, it's a semi-controlled environment. It's convenient as the homeowner to have it installed there. It's a little bit closer to the electrical panel, so there's a lot of motivations to put it there. So we said, well, if the single-family home is the bread and butter of fire response for the U.S. Fire Service, and these batteries are going to be involved, let's take a look at inside the two-car garage. The garages don't have just batteries in them. There's some really cool marketing that shows you this is an energy storage unit inside a residential garage, and the only thing that's in there is like an EV and the energy storage unit. But we all know, for those of us that have garages, that there's super duper important stuff that accumulates over the years, and you cannot get rid of it because you got to have it. And that stuff looks like you see in this photo over here. And to me, as a fire protection engineer, what that looks like is secondary fuels. So when we look at the breakdown of what that is, that's cellulosic materials, things like cardboard, paper, storage of wood. There's also a ton of plastics, and as we know, the fire service is still adjusting after decades of transition to plastics to how plastics can accelerate fire growth. So we decided to represent that with boxes of fuel, and this is what UL uses for standard sprinkler tests. It's basically plastic cups inside cardboard boxes. We know a lot about how it burns, and it lets us run tests the same way every time. So we represented the extra fuel inside that garage. Finally, a couple other things we did. There you can see some still photos up the right-hand side of this slide. What we wanted to do is simulate a fire department response up to the point where they start making access to the garage, where they ventilate. So this representation of a garage here is a steel structure we built to withstand up to about 2 psi. We had to run this inside our laboratory. So we had that and some deflagration venting. We didn't want to blow up our lab and end our project. So you see that steel garage followed by a typical roll-up garage door. The advice of the panel was basically there's the inverted L, there's the inverted V. Those are the common approaches to opening up a garage door. We decided to go with the inverted V based on consensus. And what we're doing there is cutting through to pre-cut that vent, so when it comes test time, we could pull it without having someone there when our research is to examine the risk. What you'll see in a video coming up is that we simulated the sparking of the saw using some pyrotechnics. We ran 4 tests. That's essentially what our resources in the project allowed us to do. One was just a baseline. We said, what's a room and contents fire in this structure look like? How long does it take to get vent limited? What happens when we pop the vent? The second test, we involved our representation of an energy storage system. So we went right up to near the limit of what the maximum allowable quantity of batteries would be for a residential installation. And then we started that in the thermal runaway and looked to see what would happen. In the next test, we said, let's assume the failure happens within the garage, because not every failure is going to be the energy storage system. Some are going to be a structure fire. Let's see if it gets into the batteries. Let's see what happens. And the fourth test was essentially a repeat of the third one, but instead of coming through the garage door, we simulated coming through from the house. So in test one, this is what the video looks like. We're simulating ventilation in that garage door. It should look like any garage operation pretty much you've ever seen. It's a vent-limited fire. Although we know smoke is fuel, thank you for the reference earlier on that. Smoke is fuel in this case. Those sparks still aren't enough to ignite that unburned fuel. We know if we vent it, the fire's going to come back because it's vent limited. But we do see a response. It does get bigger, but it takes time. And this is what that time looks like. So the fire develops up into a point where that first vertical line shows it becomes vent limited. After about a minute, we let that fire die down and sort of choke itself out for a minute. Then we open that vent and let the fire come back. It took about 10 minutes with that configuration in that garage, but you see the temperatures come back, and eventually the temperatures near the floor look pretty close to the temperatures near the ceiling. That's basically when we're saying that garage would be fully involved. So in test two, we did things, as I mentioned, a little differently. Now we've got energy storage units. You can see it on the photo on the left, on the right-hand side. They're just metal cabinets we fabricated, filled them full of batteries, cylindrical 18650 cells, like some legacy products you use. There's still some out there using that. It allows us to understand how the propagation occurs. And we started a thermal runaway in a single one of the cells, and you can see it releases that gas. The lighter products of that gas are coming up and accumulating near the ceiling. The heavier products are accumulating near the floor. But the important thing is, though there's plenty of hot surfaces, there's sparks come out of those cells, that enclosure's got it all trapped up, and it keeps going through propagation of thermal runaway. It's sort of like the cylinder, a propane cylinder has been turned on. It's just leaking into the garage at this point. Eventually, we did get an ignition, but you saw we got so much smoke and gas built up, we lost visibility. And then here's how that looks on the outside. So you see a little bit of smoke. Looks like it could be a normal fire. In fact, Hunter was there with us on that second floor. I think Hunter was probably comfortably at the window. Everyone else kind of jumped and ran over when that door popped, and he said, "That looks just like surprise." And then here's how that fire development looked in that garage. So we had no fire, as you saw in that video. Gas building up, gas building up. So first thermal runaway happens at about 20 minutes. We had about 16 more minutes before it found its own ignition source and ignited. Then, with all that gas built up and burning inside the garage, we're basically like that. We're at flashover. So in test three, we did things a little differently. Started the room and contents fire, let it get into the batteries, and saw some things look a little bit different. We're in test two. You could see some of that low-hanging smoke like Hunter mentioned. In test three, that smoke, because of the heat of the fire, becomes more buoyant. It doesn't hang near the floor. It's hot now, so it wants to go up. And also, those plastics, that cardboard generated soot. So any of that typical lazy white smoke, which you should train yourself to see, but in this case, we couldn't see it. Its signature was masked by the soot and the temperature from the room and contents fire. Now, this is where the Uber fuel reference comes from, because I'll ask you to watch the thermal image on the bottom right and compare that to what you saw in test two. So we're preparing to ventilate. Our pyrotechnic operates, and immediately we have flaming of that smoke coming out around that curve cut for that inverted V, and then it kind of moves around the frame of that door. So already we have a clue now. This smoke is more flammable because that fire is burning the batteries inside, causing them to release their gas. There's not enough ventilation inside the garage for that gas to burn, so it burns where it can, where it meets fresh air outside. So test four, very similar result, same setup. We initiated the fire within the room and contents. The batteries went into thermal runaway. We let that fire become vent limited, and obviously we have this building battery gas concentration. So you'll see the first action, we used a cable operated winch to open that door. So things look fairly normal. I mean, I'm not a smoke reading kind of person, but to me, I wouldn't distinguish that from any other kind of smoke coming out that door. But about 40 seconds after we opened that, we saw this occur, which that's not gonna send anyone flying backwards into the house, but that meets our definition of backdraft. So we opened a vent, induced that exchange of hot smoke with fresh air from inside the house. Now that smoke is coming into the house and accumulating, and that air mixed in around where that fire was actively burning, and effectively, when it reached the right concentration, ignited the upper layer and pushed some flames right through that door into what would be the house. So that left us with a few unanswered questions. We said, all right, we know that it's a size-up challenge. It can be very difficult to identify when batteries are involved. But if you do, what are some questions we need to run further testing to figure out the answers to? And one is, how do you approach if battery involvement is suspected? How much battery gas does it take before you create an explosion hazard? I mean, we don't want to create this sense of hysteria, like, is a cell phone inside a garage going to cause an explosion? Is an e-bike going to cause an explosion? Is an EV going to cause an explosion? I mean, we have to take into account how often these things fail, but when they fail, what is enough gas to make that happen? And then finally, what's the nature of the explosion? Is the door going to fly off every time? Will exterior walls, interior walls, is there going to be a risk of structural collapse? So we wanted to understand, how do these events start to take place? What can you as a first responder do on your approach during size up to prepare you for the risks that may be present? I'm going to turn it over to Ben to talk about the second project.
Sure, thanks, Adam. So, as Adam had mentioned, the first project that we went through looked to help us understand the difference between if batteries are involved or they're not in an underventilated two-car garage scenario. What does that look like? And then we wanted to go one step further. What do the explosion pieces specifically look like in a more controlled environment? So we went on to this second stage project, which tried to be, if you will, a little more realistic in the sense of a fully representative garage structure, tested in an outdoor situation as opposed to inside our large-scale laboratory, and to include a higher level of control in what we're doing to see what the results would be given that level of control. So the two main objectives were to assess the explosion hazards, what they look like in that controlled environment, and then if we do control them, what is the resulting outcome? So we ran a total of about 20 tests, 3 different types in total, and a first series of tests. Thank you. So as I mentioned, 3 test types in total. The first tests were essentially what we would call bag tests, as a colloquial term, where we would have a premixture of a flammable gas with an oxidizer, air, inside of a control volume space. We would ignite, and we'd observe the results. The second type was a gas release or dispersion case, where we're simulating the release of that gas naturally into the space. And then finally, the third type was an actual battery test, where we took a similar mock-up of an ESS system, very similar to the ones that Adam had mentioned in our previous project, and observed the results afterwards. So as kind of an important prerequisite to describing some of this, so as we all know, lithium-ion batteries release flammable gases. The term used earlier today was a cocktail of different gases, which accumulate and can ignite. So as part of the process for this testing, we had to simulate that. So we would have a premixture of gas of the various components, things like carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and hydrocarbons, and we can then mix that controlled gas with air to produce the situation that we're looking for. Generally speaking, in the bag tests and in the dispersion tests, we had 2 different types of that simulated gas that we worked with. One was intended to represent your common NCA chemistry cells, while the other looked at more LFP cells, which are an increasingly common format of lithium-ion battery. So to conduct this testing, we developed the large-scale residential structure with a 2-car garage door on the front and a variety of instrumentation to measure things like temperature increase and also the resulting pressures that are produced both inside the enclosure and in front of the enclosure after the event happens. So this video demonstrates the different series of bag tests that we produced. As they get bigger and bigger, the damage increases until eventually we start ejecting doors. So this harkens back to what we saw in a variety of field incidents, including the Erie, Colorado incident, where with very little prior warning, we have an ejection of the garage door if there's sufficient gas present. So in the case of those bag tests, we were producing what we call a partial volume deflagration, where relatively small amounts of gas, if rightly mixed in one part of that bigger volume, can produce still a relatively substantial amount of damage. So this video here shows an example of one of the dispersion tests where we leak gas in more naturally into the space and then ignite with a generic ignition source. And in this case, the results happen a little more slowly, but we can still produce enough overpressure to cause the door to eject. And then finally to our third type of test, an actual representative ESS mock-up that we drive into thermal runaway and we allow it to progress naturally. So like we saw in the first series of tests, the gas is ejected with the heavier components on the floor, lighter components near the ceiling. And after some time, we see that characteristic release of white gas and vapors from the garage space. So in this test, we did have a relatively minor deflagration event, really more of a bowing and slight damage of the door, perhaps maybe a little bit less severe than what we observed in our previous test series. So when we pulled all of this together with the variety of tests that we ran, both with the dispersion and with those bag tests, we put together some plots, and this is all still in draft form. We're working on putting this into a more formal setting for publishing. Let's see if I can, yes, there we go. Okay, so I'll start with this plot on the left here. So those plots there are traces of the pressure that's produced inside of, or was produced inside of that garage enclosure when the gas is ignited. And that sort of blue column there indicates that pressure range where we started to see the door actually detach. So as the amount of gas increases, the severity of damage increases, and around that pressure range, around 0.2 to 0.5 psi, is where we started to see the whole garage door come off, essentially. The more complicated plot here on the right-hand side, and apologies, it's a little hard to see, but the point of that plot was to look at the progression of damage and relating that to the fundamental properties we were looking at. So that y-axis here is overpressure, so how much pressure was produced inside of the enclosure. And then down here on the other axis is impulse. So essentially that pressure times how long it's being applied. And these lines here represent different thresholds of damage. And some of the higher ones here come from relatively old literature that looks at blast damage to brick structures and blast damage to people as a result of proximity to an overpressure wave from some blast source. And then here, there's a purple line and a red line. These are ones that we added for this study that are more representative of the type of damage we were seeing in modern structures, where we started seeing things like cracking studs or damaging drywall or ejecting doors. And this red line was when we started to see what we would call damage to the fire protection envelope. Things where if you damage them, the chances of fire spread post-explosion to the adjacent structure is much higher. Whereas this purple line was more severe types of damage that would also damage the envelope but perhaps cause structural instability as well. So down here are the plots of the various tests. So as you can see, with the larger the individual bags of mixed gas, the more damage we started to observe. And one of the main points here was to then compare this back to real products, to real batteries, and what that could potentially look like. Is that time? No? Okay. Cool. So we saw that on the very low end, if we look at something like a car starter, that's maybe tens of watt hours, we're really not going to start seeing any damage, even in a very idealized and perfected experimental condition. But if we start moving north, where we have liters or sizes of batteries in terms of watt hours that are representing bigger items that would still be present in these garages, things like e-mobility devices, e-scooters, or up to EVs, then there starts to be enough gas produced that even if the whole volume isn't filled with that gas, you still can produce enough overpressure to start causing damage to the structure and maybe exacerbate future fire conditions. So then back to a reality check. Are we doing the right things, and are the results that we are observing in a more controlled environment representative of what we see in the field? And what some of these incidents that Adam has mentioned show us is that yes, we do see real conditions where, with very little prior warning, there is an explosion event and garage doors can be ejected in such a way that they can cause a threat to personnel in front of that garage. So back to that video of the Erie, Colorado event compared directly to one of the test videos. It serves as a means of exemplifying our point. So essentially wrapping this all together, we see that one of the new hazards is that the involvement of e-mobility devices in real lithium-ion battery products, while the incidents of these thermal runaway events are relatively rare, they can produce enough damage to present a problem and a hazard to personnel and to denizens. So now I'll bring it back to Adam for a few more.
So I want to stay in reality check mode. This is e-mobility device. This one's been on our webpage a while. Maybe you've seen it, maybe you haven't. But if you haven't, let's take a quick run through. What you're going to see in the top right is the moped-style e-mobility device, kind of sit on top. Very common, very popular in New York City right now. This and the sort of power assist bike, the ones that have pedals, you may or may not be using them. These are sort of the scale of the events causing the most trouble. So watch that top right and get the video going here. What you'll see is thermal runaway. So you can probably see that in the bottom with the thermal imager. And so that kind of builds up a gas cloud. There's only a few seconds of gas release, though, until it ignites. Now, the first thing that happened, whether you caught it or not, because the lighting's a little funky here, that window blew out, this window blew out, and now we have that e-bike ignition source. Certainly it being an ignition source is a challenge, but there's enough fuel in it that it's also causing that jetting up the ceiling and igniting that couch. We know if you ignite a couch with the way modern furniture is built, that you may have 3 to 4 minutes before flashover. But what this video is showing you is, in combination with that ignition source, the battery adding fuel, igniting the couch faster, the couch igniting other things faster, and the windows having been blown out by that quick pulse of gas, the fire self-ventilated. So within a minute, we saw a transition to flashover. So now someone's charging that in their high-rise apartment in New York City by the front door, right where you're going to grab it on your way out to work or whatever, if you're one of these delivery drivers, or as I learned today, the trades like them quite a lot. That's going to be between you and your means of egress, with now a fire that's looking to go to flashover in about a minute. Essentially, we saw the same thing in the bedroom case. So this is now even more close quarters. Imagine someone sleeping in this bed. You're going to see very much the same thing. You'll see thermal runaway first, a bit of gas buildup. And this is what Ben and I were trying to show in those garage tests, is that gas builds up, but it only takes a limited amount, a partial volume of that room to cause the deflagration that causes enough pressure rise. It only takes about 1/10 of a PSI to 1/4 PSI to blow that window out. And you see very much the same thing. Now in this case, that deflagration blew the glass about 33 feet out that window. But we see again that the e-bike is really a very strong ignition source. It pushes jets across the ceiling in that case, which ignites everything a bit faster, and we go to flashover within a minute. So we're going to roll right now into just the next set of slides on response considerations. So we laid out for you what the challenges are, what causes this different fire environment due to mostly residential energy storage is what we looked at, but we'll throw in e-mobility. We'll skip through that because we've seen this already. And so one of the first considerations we came up with, our project had a technical panel of about 14 different experts. So Hunter was on board, Chief Abbott was on board as well. We had some other experts from around the country to help temper our research. This is why we say we do research with the fire service. So we wanted to develop response considerations representative of what's going to help you across different areas of the U.S. So what you just saw many examples of are when lithium-ion batteries undergo thermal runaway without burning. So when that gas phase is releasing, just like in those last couple e-mobility videos, that can create an explosion hazard without you having any signature on the outside of the building. So the garage test was pretty clear because we were forcing that with bags full of flammable gas. But in the case of that ranch-style home in those videos just now, you saw how some battery gas followed by ignition could be an explosion. Hunter experienced that in Surprise, Arizona, and we've seen that in other incidents as well. So here, obviously going back to our mock-up video, is the beginning of that hazard. Are you going to see anything as you're pulling up from the street? Has the homeowner seen this run inside, called 911? So the question is, are you going to be able to tell? The timing of that explosion is unpredictable. Ben referred to the test where we were out in the field. We did that sort of third style test where we mocked up a battery system. It released flammable gas for a while, not as long as we saw in the lab. The test 2 I showed you where it sort of blew the door open and blew smoke across the lab. Everything was the same. The challenge is the behavior of the batteries isn't the same every time. So that timing is going to be unknown to you. In this case here, in that test 2, we can show the timeline of development and show that gas built up basically until the garage was completely full. The important thing to take away is that that's possible, but that's not going to happen every single time. A significant explosion hazard can develop before you see any signs on the exterior. We kind of went through that already. Unburned battery gas ignites readily. So that video where we referred to Uber fuel demonstrated the difference between what we at FSRI and others have been making the point of for years is that smoke in an event-limited fire is fuel. The fire would burn if there was enough oxygen available in that room. So you already know that that's a hazard. If batteries become involved in significantly enough quantity, it may enhance that flammability. And we saw that, I'll show it one more time. We saw an example of how a cutting tool could be the ignition source. We've had some close calls. I think Cody, Wyoming had a tractor-trailer body full of cells that were going to get recycled, going into thermal runaway, filling that tractor-trailer body full of flammable gas. No real difference in compared to what we did here. Without active fire, lithium-ion battery pack thermal runaways might be recognizable by that white-gray smoke like we saw in Surprise, fairly low wind conditions out in Surprise. In our lab, as you saw sort of on the far left here, we have obviously no wind in the lab, so it kind of builds up and you can say, oh, that's weird. Smoke doesn't normally do that. It's pretty white. It's not really moving. It's just kind of hanging. But the video Ben showed, so add a little sunlight, add a little bit of wind. That's not even much wind. It was about 5 miles an hour. All of a sudden, things are getting harder. It sort of looks like steam when it's outside. So it's not really a reliable mechanism. You could say, oh, that looks kind of weird. And obviously, we're not going to advise anyone to peel back their face piece if you're wearing that already and go smelling anything. But Smell is another component you might recognize for this. Doesn't smell like a normal fire. Doesn't smell like a plastics fire. So I'll replay that just so you can see. I mean, does that, as compared to what Hunter showed you in Surprise, look like another Surprise, Arizona incident? Maybe, if you really know what you're looking for. And even then, I've watched this video after not watching it for a while and going, that is pretty tricky. With or without active fire, one of the things you can notice, and you can sort of go through YouTube and see some of these different failure videos, especially I think it was a parking garage with a bunch of e-scooters in it, showed a fantastic video of all this smoke and gas building up at the ceiling while this weird sort of, almost liquid-looking layer of gas fills along the floor. If you see that, whether there's an active fire or not, that's indicative of batteries and thermal runaway. What we saw, though, so let's say we go back to that garage where we're outside. Maybe you get that shot at that, characteristic white vapor. Maybe you don't if there's an active fire going, because that soot and that temperature, like I mentioned, can completely mask those things. And what did we see in those videos? All of a sudden, ventilation may become something different altogether. That fire may be moving faster. This table, essentially, we could study it a little while, but what it showed us was in the test series in the lab, when we used our 5 and 6 gas meters and put them at different distances from the floor, we were looking to see, is there something that registers? Is the CO way higher? Are you going to see, we know that the batteries are made out of electrolytes, which are essentially similar to gasoline. They're long, big hydrocarbon molecules. So you're going to see something on LEL. Across all of those, essentially what we showed was the signature of a vent-limited fire and a vent-limited fire with batteries involved versus even just batteries themselves. There's nothing where you can pick up that meter and go, that's batteries. So what you can end up with without this knowledge is essentially walking up to some kind of structure, whatever it may be, looking at your portable gas meter and putting yourself next to that door in Surprise, next to that garage door in Erie, and putting yourself right in the path. So perhaps the better thing to do is consider where the vent points, if this is batteries involved. So that kind of leads, this was one of Sean's main points. Look for other signs. There's a house on my street. When I drive by it every day, I see a Mercedes, 2 EVs, and rooftop solar. Otherwise, there's no indication that there's any batteries on their property. When their garage door is up, I don't know how they did what they did with the codes, because it's full of Tesla Powerwalls. I'm not saying anything about that product, but it's behind that garage door, and there's somehow more than the code allows. So firefighters are at greatest risk for explosion hazards in the driveways, as we showed in Erie, I think as you saw in Montreal, as you saw in Surprise, Arizona. This is what you might see in Erie. So I already kind of made this point about portable gas meters. What are you going to learn if you're putting yourself in the explosion hazard? You may do that with no direct benefit of identifying there's batteries involved. So this is just another case where we're showing there was some gas and then a small deflagration that essentially just blew open that door a little bit. And one of the major takeaways from the Department of Energy test number 2 was, because those conditions can change rapidly, you need to be prepared for those changing conditions in advance. So whether this is, we also did a report on the Surprise, Arizona incident. We did some research tests that were similar to the Surprise, Arizona incident. And basically in all cases, what we're finding is the common denominator is when batteries are involved, be in full structural firefighting gear, be on SCBA, and have charged hose lines ready, because as test 2 showed, when that garage door came off, it didn't just come off, it also burned all the gases inside that garage, which is going to get the structure involved very quickly. One thing Ben's taking a look at that he let you know about was, we're also looking at, if you get that explosion or that deflagration inside that garage, can you we sort of rely on the fire resistive performance of the separation between the garage and the house, or maybe the garage and the bedroom above, and we rely on that self-closing door, which we should have. But if you've damaged those membranes, are those barriers being membranes, is the fire going to stay in check there, or now do you have to worry about fire spread more rapidly into the house? That's something we don't have data on, but after seeing the damage, we are significantly concerned about it. Reignition was brought up earlier. Of course, obviously, we could argue lack of extinguishment or reignition. I'm going to go with reignition is an issue. So essentially what we're saying is as long as there's batteries on site that are damaged, unless they're fully removed from that site, some argument as to who should be doing that. But let's say they're still on site. Hose lines need to remain charged to manage any reignition issues. Okay, so now we can go into the next session.
But when it comes to these battery cells in garages to support, to support our homes, moving forward in these garages, I think a lot of them typically don't have windows, and that's probably a security function, the way they're designed. But should we be moving towards deflagration panels in these garages? Should we be moving towards, a code requirement for a more fortified door between the house space and the garage? Maybe the walls shouldn't be sheetrock. Maybe they should be cement board moving forward. Also, I think the fire service was instrumental in getting markings when trusses are introduced into buildings. Maybe we need to start moving towards, if we have these energy storage systems in these even private residents, that there is an exterior marking. And then just kind of a couple of quick questions, if you could comment. And maybe the answer with a lot of stuff when I asked Dan, and I know he trained you, was, well, it depends. Do we know much on the flammable range of what's coming off these? I know you're saying if, we can't really meet it to see if it's ordinary combustibles burning or these batteries. And then how come it seems to me, just looking at this, it seems like there's a significant difference in the smoke. I mean, you're doing some of these tests and you're putting pyrotechnics to try to ignite this smoke. We're not getting it. And then within a couple of seconds of a failure in a micro-mobility device, we have these significant events. And my question is, do we think that those events that you showed with the scooters are happening in the compartment, or they're actually happening in the module? And the smoke is in the compartment, but the module is really experiencing that deflagration just in the container, and not necessarily the smoke that's in the space, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. Good questions. Let me try to walk through the path I think makes sense. So we have an extremely good idea of what's in the smoke, largely because of UL 9548 testing a few years ago has let us and others test a lot of different cells from different manufacturers, because we're essentially forcing the cells to fail, capturing that gas, measuring what's in it. So we know the flammable range very well, because that's one of the things that gets tested. We know it's a mixture of hydrogen, CO, CO2, and those electrolytes that get broken down into some hydrocarbons. So we know the flammability range is somewhere like 6% by volume to somewhere more than like 30% by volume. It's pretty close to methane. So it's going to ignite kind of like methane. The average properties are that it burns kind of like propane. with most cells, although since we're looking at a lot of different kinds of batteries, it can be more reactive. LFP tends to have more hydrogen, so you see a faster burning velocity, you see a potentially more severe explosion. So with that all being said, if I go back to the garage and fire protection for the home, I love supporting, from my background, any additional fire protection to a home, especially in terms of fire resistance features. They sit there, they don't do much. Some would argue, and I'm part of that some, that they are affordable to be built into homes. So I would love to see us to gain some ground back from where we used to be with some fire resistance in homes. But does it make sense to add a deflagration vent? Not really. In fact, what we found, we've joked about this with the deflagration vent industry some, is that those garage doors are fantastic deflagration vents. They were blown off way before the structure was taking damage. I kind of say that in jest, but now if you're looking at installing something, a significant size battery, e-mobility and above, essentially is what we're finding, in a basement, well, now you got those teeny little windows, if there's any windows at all. Or if it's in even a uninhabited space inside a structure, the smaller your volume versus the size of the battery, you may be looking at an explosion hazard. So I support and will continue to stimulate some discussion as to where does it make sense to put these different items. One of the things we have is our Take Charge campaign basically says put these in smart places when you're charging them. But to try and wrap that up, I don't think it makes sense to try to add too many fire protection features. Let's just be smarter about where we're putting these things and how we're installing them. You had one or two other questions. I don't have the mind of a decree here.
I'm sorry to build off
Yep.
that, and just a quick thought. The door does make a good deflagration panel, but standing in the street, most of my people are going to be like the moth to the flame and standing right in front of that. So if there was something that would maybe divert that pressure away from that door so it doesn't come flying off towards
Sure.
me or my people, is just my thought. And then the other thing, and it's building off something that the public utility by us is doing. They're now installing flammable gas detectors by their points of service. So we get it, and I was just at a conference the other night, we get it all the time. The public utility is reporting 10% of the LEL has been reached. So maybe in the future, could that be something that's built in, where if we start to see that gases are being produced by these cells, that there could be an announcement made, transmitted to the fire department, letting us know maybe before there's an elevation in temperature or something. And then the other thing, now they have the ability to remotely disconnect the power, and maybe that's something that in the future, some of these devices that are coming into the homes, would there be the ability to either remotely isolate the structure
Yep.
from these cells, or maybe even start to shed the energy that's stored?
I think let's come back to that in the panel, because I think Bob's dying over there to answer this question also. But I think he and others will have some better info than I can even share with you on that. So let's definitely do that at the panel. Yep, absolutely. Yeah, I think we have a break now. Continue. Appreciate you all with your patience listening to Ben and I. I guess we have a lot to say today. So we went through a lot of what UL R&D and what UL FSRI has put together, you know, with the fire service, with IAFF the last few years. I know it went by like an hour, but it's been a few years of work. So now it only makes sense to cover what direction we're going in. There's a lot of unsolved challenges with electrification. So we'll go through some of the UL research programs. Right now, I'll talk about what FSRI has in store for this next 3 years. Ben's going to cover what UL R&D is working on currently. So we'll just address the next step in EV, e-mobility, UL 1487, buses, planes, appliances, forklifts, boats, power equipment, heavy equipment, trains. I mean, we could go on for a while, but the important thing to take away, we're not actually going to cover all those. The important thing to take away, and one of the reasons why we've looked at fundamentals of why hazards are coming from batteries and how, depending on what they're in or where they're located, can change fire dynamics, is because we can't keep up with all that. We can't possibly hope to keep up with all of that. My colleagues over in UL Solutions and UL Standards Engagement have a heavy lift to do to keep up. I was just talking with a gentleman on the break that we can reasonably expect to start seeing batteries inside cooktops, inside your home. That's a push. And everywhere where we see a cord or an old power source, a motor, it's a candidate for electrification because lithium-ion batteries, when they're safe, they fail at a very low rate. They're light for what they are for a power source. They're cheap for what they are. They're fantastic at doing what they do. But it's like the transition to plastics 40, 50 years ago. They're going to start changing. They're not going to start changing. They have been changing the fire environment. So the first thing that that UL FSRI launched in the last couple of years was an electric vehicle fire research project. Electric vehicle fire research is not new. It's been going on for about 10, 15 years internationally. North America was not the first to start adopting electric vehicles, so we started seeing EV research in Korea, France, other parts of Europe, Sweden. And what that research basically shows is that right now, today, with the stock rolling off the lot, the incidence of fire is lower with EVs than internal combustion engine vehicles going down the road. The asterisk there, the thing to keep in mind, is that EVs are fairly new, so it may be fine, but we don't have the data yet to know how things will change over time. That is one of the main drivers for why FSRI has elected to go after electric vehicle research, so we have an understanding of when that fire does happen. What does that look like? What are the consequences? How do traditional tactics work, and do we need modified tactics? We're not so interested at FSRI of how frequently these things happen. We want to equip first responders with guidance on what to do when it happens. Limited data does show that there are some differences in occupational exposure hazard. This does come at a time when we're looking at firefighter cancer more than ever before. So when we take a hard look, international research has showed so far that you see some of the elements of the battery: lithium, nickel, manganese, cobalt. Those things aren't great for you. Smoke isn't great for you, but are they meaningfully different? I say limited data because we don't have much of a sense right now. There isn't an urgency. People aren't dropping dead at the scene of EV fires from immediate exposure. But as we continue to worry about firefighter cancer and other long-term exposure hazards, what does it mean? How can we make sense of it? What we do know right away from our experience in the United States is this argument that's surfacing because we have this vacuum of information on how to deal with electric vehicle fires. Are we going to let it burn, which is an increasingly popular topic, or are we going to use copious amounts of water? Those are the two approaches you see. Those are the ones that are making the nightly news. When we use copious amounts of water, what are we doing? Are we putting 40,000 gallons of water on it, and is it doing anything? or you're just throwing 40,000 gallons on the body panels of a car while the battery burns itself out underneath. Those are the types of information that we're looking to understand. So I already kind of got ahead of myself, but are the hazards changing with EVs? And if so, what's different? And then we know some things are different. We know they don't quite burn the same. So I have to give a shout out to Boston Fire Department here. This was a pilot burn we did before we launched into our project off in Chicago, where we burned a Hyundai Kona EV and got kind of a preview of what are we going to be expecting when we go to the lab. And so we tried some basic tactics. We tried filling the body of the vehicle, sort of like fill the tub, see if we can get some fire control that way. We tried the undercar nozzles. But these are the new tools that want to start making their way into the fire service. So I think where we're going to draw a line on this project, I'm pushing this project to draw this line, is there are new tools, there are additives for water. There's never been a better time to be confused on whether you need a fire blanket, whether you need additives, whether you need something that's going to poke holes, cut holes, something you hammer in. I mean, it's a good time to be selling products for EVs because there's not a lot of information on whether or not the equipment you have already, whether it works. Maybe we have to use it differently, but running some numbers on this, if you take the average fire blanket and you purchase one for every single one of the 34,000 fire departments in North America, that's $68 million of fire blankets that the taxpayers are paying for. If you buy a penetrating tool, just based on the price of one I won't name, 34,000 gives you $1.4 billion. So do you need that? We're already stretched on budgets to buy tools you need, so why not take a look at the trucks which carry firefighters, nozzles, hoses, and water, and whether we can use that smarter. Now, if we can't, we have an understanding to move forward that we need something else. But we have to do that first. Frankly, that hasn't been done. So the first part of our project is to burn vehicles in our laboratory. We want to burn them without any intervention, the let it burn scenario, and understand what happens. We do that with electric vehicles. Frankly, what we found is we also have to do that with brand new internal combustion engine vehicles. I don't know how common the knowledge is, but what we're finding is as vehicle designs have changed, even with the gas engine vehicles you have, I have this excellent Ford Expedition Max out in the lot that's a rental. The thing is the biggest vehicle I've ever been able to rent that's not commercial. It's got a glass roof. It's got more plastic in it than anything I've ever seen in my life. And how is that going to burn versus the car, the Ford Taurus I had in the 90s? I mean, there's a lot more plastic. So we know those fires are going to be getting bigger because there's more fuel. We know they're going to be burning faster because they've got more window space. They're larger vehicles. They've got glass roofs, which might be failing and enabling more ventilation for those fires. So let's compare apples to apples. We need to burn modern vehicles with modern vehicles. So that's kind of the plan here. We'll compare that data. The cars we chose, since we have a budget for this project, which is internal, that's a wonderful thing about working where I work. We were able to fund the purchase of these vehicles. We didn't take donations from manufacturers. We did take a couple cars from Boston Fire Department, but the idea is any findings are our own. They're not influenced. And so we went out and selected based on what's available, what's being made today, what are the most common vehicles on the road. If you go looking at the numbers, you're going to find basically Tesla runs away with it. There are so many Model 3s and Ys and Xs and Ss compared to everything else that we had to pick one Tesla to test. We also picked things that have been around a bit longer, so the Nissan Leaf is in there. The Chevy Bolt is becoming a popular car. The Ford Mustang Mach-E is having some impressive sales relative to other EVs. So basically, we kind of took the vehicles that we think are going to provide the biggest bang for the buck when you reasonably expect to respond to an EV incident. That has to be kind of tempered, though. I know you can't read that. I can't either. It's a list I put together when I made that slide to show those are the 6 vehicles we're burning. Everything in red is something that I can afford with my salary. Everything in black is like the Lucids and everything else. But Those are all different models of vehicles that have been announced to be released between 2023 and 2025. So some of the things that we have to do aren't going to be very helpful if it's for this model year of this car, use these tactics. For this model year of this car, use these tactics. So what we're trying to do with all of this is look at how does vehicle construction affect how these EV fires are burning? How does that affect what tactics you're going to use? There's an app, there are apps now for quickly pulling up emergency response guides. The quality of those vary based on manufacturers. The availability varies based on manufacturers. So what we're trying to do with our technical panel is come up with rules of thumb, things you can use, in addition to the resources that are available. They are good. I'm not saying they're not good. I'm just saying that we need to have things, you know, I don't want to add another acronym to the fire service, but we need to have simple tools for response. These couple slides, I'll skip through them quickly, but basically what it shows is for internal combustion engine vehicles, the fire tends to start in the engine bay. It's where things get hot. It's where there's flammable liquids. There's electrical wiring that can fail. For electric vehicles, that data is not there. So what we did for the gas-powered cars, we started the fire under the hood. For the battery-powered cars, we said, well, the incidents we're seeing involve the battery pack, so let's start it in the battery pack. So I mentioned these questions already. I won't spend too much time on them. A little bit of detail. What we're measuring is how fast does the fire grow? How big does it get? How long does it last? One of the biggest concerns when we're polling the fire service, when we get questions in after events like this, when we asked our technical panel, is are these fires going to keep us on scene for 3 hours, 9 hours, 17 hours, whatever it is? There's concern that resources will be committed for an extended period of time. So we're taking a look at when it starts burning, how long does that burning take? As well as what are the risks of spread to something else? So it's fine and dandy to look at it on the side of the road. What if it's inside a structure? What if it's inside a parking garage with other vehicles parked around it? How does that risk of ignition change? Well, if you burn just the cabin of a vehicle, you're going to get a pretty big fire. If it starts in the cabin, before it can involve that battery, before it can involve that gas tank, it's all basically the same fire. Same materials, same vehicle chassis, big fire. So what's different about EVs? We've seen some jets on YouTube videos. So one of the things we're looking to do is measure, do those jets make a difference? Are they going to meaningfully contribute to the next car over igniting? Or once that fire is in that vehicle cabin, or if it starts in that vehicle cabin, is that the thing that matters? We won't be able to go into it, but obviously there's concerns about whether sprinkler systems in garages, like NFPA 88A. Hot area of argument right now, will sprinklers work? We don't have the data. What is the occupational exposure hazard? So what we're looking at, and there's really too many measurements to even cover today, but we're looking at what's in the smoke. So what gets released from the smoke, and then we have some measurements in our laboratory that are designed to help us understand what ends up on turnout gear. Can it be laundered off turnout gear? All critical questions. So this is a photo of the one of the Hyundai Konas we burned. It's sitting in a pan so we can capture runoff water during suppression. That pan is on top of a weighing system that we engineered basically to tell us with how much weight, as that fire burns, as that car loses weight, we can know how big that fire is. Here's basically what we've seen so far if I just did a quick comparison. So the Hyundai Kona is the only vehicle platform we have available to us that lets us take a look. Both of these lines here are that measurement of the fire size. So this is in megawatts. It lets us understand how fast the fires grow. And so what we did was we actually, for this vehicle, we ignited under the hood, even in the battery vehicle, and saw basically this fire pretty much grows and develops the same. It gets into the cabin. After it gets into the cabin, this black line's the gas tank. So in this case, with this one vehicle, that gas tank fire, when the gas tank failed with 12.9 gallons of gas in it, we got the biggest fire out of the gasoline car. What's different is, as that cabin fire kind of continues to burn out, it moved through the front seats into the back seats and began to heat up that battery late in the fire. This is maybe where your reignition risk comes in potentially, depending on what your scene looks like. Late in the fire, that's when the battery got involved. And so the battery burned out somewhat suddenly by our observations. All in all, the cabin fire is basically the same thing because it was the same car, but the gas tank and battery burned differently. So that is something we'd like to continue doing with more comparisons in the future. We haven't burned our gas vehicles yet. That'll happen in the latter half of this year. Heat flux, something I mentioned for looking at ignition risk. The way we're doing that is basically having this very highly instrumented metal wall, lets us look at it with thermal imagers. Some of the engineers I work with are able to look at that data. This is an example of it. So you can see the fire started under the hood. It's developing there. As it starts to come out of this wheel well, you'll see this panel's, this is a view of the panel up front here. It's right on this side. And you see the temperatures coming up. That means the heat flux is coming up. So that's the radiant energy hitting that panel. And that is what's allowing us to do this two-dimensional look to see, are those jets going to make a difference? So I'm very proud of that work. That's basically a measurement method pioneered by some of our engineers, so it's also new to the fire research community. And this is really the first major project outside of its original fire investigation work where we're able to use that. So that's a very, very interesting piece of technology we're able to use. Other than that, we have a smoke reservoir that we built above the car in our lab. We're capturing the smoke. We're using some gas analyzers to measure what we're seeing in there. And we are also capturing particulates. So we have a partnership from the EPA and the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, as well as NC State and Duke. So there's quite a lot of interest in the occupational exposures. This is some of their measurement instrumentation. So we also, in addition to our gas analyzers to measure what's going into the plume, we're particularly concerned with BTEXs. Don't quiz me on that, but it's benzene, toluene, ethylene, a few known carcinogens that cause firefighter cancer. And so we're able to target those very directly, compare them with our research on training fires and other occupational exposure hazards to determine if there's elevated risk of exposures long-term from what comes off of electric vehicles. NIOSH is also capturing particulate on cookie sheets, kind of scraping into jars and running some analysis on what the sizes of the particulates are. So are they respirable or not? And what's in them? So once they're in you, what does that affect? And actually at this point, I think I'm going to turn it over to Ben. So that's it for electric vehicles. The transition here is that consumer products, I showed you that earlier, are really driving the most frequent hazard. I mean, we can all prepare for energy storage system fires. We should. We can all prepare for electric vehicle fires, but the calls you're going to run first are most likely going to be from consumer lithium-ion battery-powered products. So what we're hoping to see, maybe even this week, is a House resolution, bipartisan legislation that pushes the CPSC towards requiring safety standards for unregulated products. In New York City and in San Francisco, that's basically the first two municipalities in the United States to push for, in New York City they call them rules, but rules that require the sale of certified products. So that could be by any nationally recognized testing laboratory, but those are UL standards, UL 2272 for hoverboards, UL 2849 for e-bikes. And the idea with those standards is to drop the frequency because those products have been evaluated against failures that are causing all of the rash of fires in major cities. So I'll turn it over to you, Ben. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Adam. So what we'll do here is these next few slides, we'll look at some tests that were conducted with e-scooters, e-mobility devices, and then go into a discussion of a standards-based fire containment approach for devices like these as one of multiple approaches that could be taken to reduce risk. So one test that was conducted out in Northbrook with a joint effort of ULS and FSRI was looking at a free burn of an e-scooter, or I guess really an e-moped. So something relatively larger that go a little bit faster. And here is an image of the battery pack that was used inside that e-scooter or e-moped. So all 18650 cells linked together inside of one large pack. As you can see, there's really no separation between the cells, and the whole thing is controlled by a relatively basic battery management system. So here's a nicely spliced together set of data showing the video of the thermal runaway event happening, followed by in lockstep with the heat release rate that we're measuring in that hood above it. So as you all remember from some of our previous, really Adam's previous slides, looking at the testing that was done inside of a mock-up residential bedroom and living room, we have gas release and immediate ignition. And in this case, we saw around 1 megawatt from the peak heat release rate of that e-moped. In this particular case, just I guess another piece of information, we initiated thermal runaway in this case using an overcharge. So we would intentionally overcharge this battery in a similar way that may happen if the incorrect charging apparatus is used with the battery, or if it was intentionally overcharged to increase range. Forms of abuse that we could actually see in the field, and then we wanted to see what the result would be compared to something like overheating the cells or puncturing them. And in this case, we think the result was a little bit more severe. So kind of harkening back to some slides from Adam, looking at then we take that same bike, what happens if we put it inside of a residential enclosure, either a bedroom or a living room, or open format living room, in this case the bedroom. So we did discuss this a little bit in the past, but I think it's still relevant to go through the videos. So very quickly, we have thermal runaway, ceiling jets, and very soon after the opening of this window from the overpressure, we start to see rollover of flames out the window and flashover within a matter of seconds. And there's flaming. So aftermath, had the windows blown out. So the next test series or phase that was conducted was taking that same bike and putting it into an open format living room condition. So once again, immediate ignition of the plume and an overpressure wave that blew out those windows. And kind of an interesting fire dynamics piece of this whole thing is that we're not only creating an extremely strong ignition source to ignite the remaining combustibles in that mock-up, but also it's creating its own ventilation in the sense that that overpressure is opening windows, it's opening cracks, it's opening areas for air to come in and feed that fire. So then, once we establish baselines of what these fires look like, both free burning and free burning within some form of enclosure, some living space, next we added residential sprinklers. And as you can see on the right-hand side, compared to what we saw with the unprotected case, the sprinklers did do a substantially good job at preventing flashover of the room and subsequent fire spread to other combustibles in the room, including the bed. And same condition here for the living room space. You can kind of see that area here where the bike plume first ignited and impinged the ceiling.
So just a quick note on that one too. For both of those tests, what we were looking at with NFSA, National Fire Sprinkler Association, was whether systems designed based on NFPA 13R and NFPA 13D would be effective. Obviously, you can see in both cases they held that fire in check and prevented ignition of secondary items. What I think is really important to note was in that living room test, we weren't quite sure what to expect, but that thermal runaway created such a strong jet of hot gas across the ceiling that instead of activating just one sprinkler from that thermal runaway, it actually hit the one in the living room, one sort of in the living room kitchen, and the two in the hall. And despite that flow condition, that pattern was actually still able to control that fire. So it was very good finding for us.
Sorry about that. So then looking at risk assessments, what are series of risk drivers, and then what are possible mitigation? So generally what we're seeing is that the safety certification, the regulation, the public education, these are all major areas that drive that first step, that first stage of risk reduction, helping people understand what the hazards are, what can be done to mitigate them, helping to regulate the products so that they are of high quality, that they're tested, and then, well, safety certification and regulation really do play into that one major goal of improving the product itself. And then later on, we'll discuss another approach that can be applied if those fail. So I think this one's really more Adam.
So I'll run through this. Those risk drivers, there are elements which we can address just through public safety education campaigns. Ben will talk about an engineering approach after this, but so last fall we announced a campaign we put together with the United States Fire Administration as partners with Consumer Product Safety Commission, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and the Fire Department of the City of New York. And that campaign was called Take Charge of Battery Safety. So you can see we leaned pretty heavily on our work of micromobility device fires and came up with this acronym where each letter from charge gives the public some advice. We have a web page we stood up along with this, batteryfiresafety.org. And just a quick run through of the acronym that homeowners can do to take charge of battery safety is to choose certified products. So we're saying stop buying unregulated. Honestly, batteries, it could be a replacement battery for your MacBook. But we're talking, in this case, specifically about micromobility products. So if you're looking for things that have been certified, handle them with care. Regardless of the quality of the instructions, they tend to come with care instructions. Those have been getting better, and that means using the charger that came with the product, not necessarily buying a cheap knockoff one because you want more or because it charges your battery faster than the one that came with the product. Also, don't be physically abusing it and expecting it to keep surviving. If you're, abusing your micromobility device, if you drop your phone, that kind of like leads into the next one. Always stay alert for warning signs. If you have abused some of these devices, look for things like swelling, listen for hissing, feel for overheating. Some of those signs can warn you that a battery has been abused and has started to fail. They don't all necessarily fail immediately. I'm sure at some point you've seen a puffy lithium-ion battery break open a product. That is now basically a dangerous product that's partially failed. Recycle devices and batteries properly. So should you see that type of thing occur, don't just throw it in the trash. Don't throw it in your single stream recycling. If you have that in your community, reach out to your waste management authority and make sure that they're providing some type of guidance. Use that guidance and dispose of it properly. So for me, in Maryland, that actually means going to my waste transfer station or a Home Depot and getting rid of my batteries there where they're expecting lithium ion. Get out quickly if there's a fire. So this is really meant to apply to the larger types of products. You don't necessarily have to flee your home if your cell phone goes into thermal runaway, but there's plenty of good YouTube videos out there. There's a Christmas time video where a guy's e-scooter goes into thermal runaway. He runs in to take care of it. He's falling down because he's in a panic. Essentially, the whole time that fire's developing, should it have gotten to his Christmas tree, he'd have been in real trouble. But the challenge is, in the short amount of time it takes him to get ready to prepare for that fire, he's already almost burning himself trying to do something about it. We know nothing would have worked, even if you had a fire extinguisher. Hitting that e-bike battery with a ABC extinguisher is not going to do anything to stop the propagation of thermal runaway down inside the product where that powder can't get. So get out quickly, call 911. We like to throw in close the door behind you because That's one of our fire control PSAs as well. And then educate others on safe practices. So that's part of our community risk reduction strategies, to encourage others to educate their family and friends. So if we look at risk again, I would say this is sort of where we're at right now with current e-scooters in metropolitan areas on regulated micromobility devices. You can reasonably expect to have moderate consequences. Maybe someone requires first aid or requires a trip to the hospital. It is not unreasonable, it's unlikely, but it's not unreasonable someone will have to go, or I'm sorry, that you could have a fatal incident. What we showed with those research experiments with NFSA was residential sprinklers are an effective means of controlling those fires, so that can drop the frequency of fatal fire events. So we should be encouraging the public and encouraging codes to be adopting residential sprinklers. And if we get to certified e-scooters, so Ben mentioned the risk drivers, if we get to certified e-scooters, certified products, we can be dropping that frequency even further. They've been abused by a standard test now and shown not to fail. They've been evaluated to make sure that the electrical system talks to the battery, charges it correctly, and so we can drop the frequency and severity of those incidents. As you can see, though, the risk is not entirely gone, and so Ben will talk about another layer of approach for how to deal with some of that residual battery risk.
Right, so if those first three, if you will, preventative measures are either not in place or happen to be surpassed, then the idea was to develop a standards approach for products that are specifically designed for lithium-ion battery containment. So these would be either, if you imagine a case-like device or a cabinet-like device, something with lockers, cubbies, something that is intentionally designed for storage and potentially charging of lithium-ion batteries for a variety of lithium-ion powered devices. So things like tool batteries or e-mobility batteries, or even up to a certain size extent, the devices themselves. So that's where the idea of UL 1487 came from, which is currently in development. And these next few slides kind of give an overview of what that is and where it's at. So as we are all well aware, and this is based off of that internal database that one of my colleagues at UL Solutions has been working on to continually update. Over the past several years, we're seeing an increase in the injuries, the fatalities, in the incidents of e-mobility as those become more and more prevalent. This is seen in striking clarity in New York City, where these forms of mobility, simply due to the fact of their convenience and their multitude of usefulness, are seen everywhere. So as time goes on and more of them proliferate, we see higher incidents, or higher rates of incidents, I should say. So then the question is, where is containment an option? If you think about the progression of the fire protection approach, the preventative measures are first, then there's things like suppression, and then things like fire containment, and then finally the intervention of the fire service. So these are some examples of some incidents in the past where having batteries stored in some form of properly tested device designed to store them and to contain them would have potentially made a difference. Cases of commercial storage of e-mobility batteries, or larger scale residential storage, for example, in a large scale apartment building where could be a designated space for people to put their batteries or their e-mobility devices. In cases like that, where these devices can be well maintained, or these products rather can be well maintained and can be installed continuously, this form of approach can be viable in preventing or reducing that risk. So the UL 1487 standard up to this point, and these slides are actually slightly out of date as we've been continually updating the standard over time, but generally there are 3 primary tests and then a series of, not necessarily more minor, but ancillary tests that are designed to look at the general function and structure of a device. So the primary 2 are the internal deflagration and the internal thermal runaway or internal fire test. And the notion is, first of all, we understand that you can have flammable gas accumulate in this containment space, and even if you have a relatively small amount of batteries, from the physics involved, you could actually have maybe one of the more severe explosions as opposed to having lots of gas released and blasting past the flammability range of that gas. No pun intended. So the internal deflagration test is designed to essentially test a product against that event, to produce an overpressure and see how the product reacts. The second, the internal thermal runaway test, is kind of one of the keystones of the standard in its current form, where we take a representative fuel package of lithium-ion batteries, something that's been standardized and relatively well vetted, and push that into thermal runaway in a controlled fashion. Let that thermal runaway event propagate and allow the product to react to it. In the way that it's currently designed, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but the way it's currently designed, we will put that fuel package in the largest single storage cavity, so something like a cubby, for example, initiate that event, and ensure that the event doesn't travel outside of that one storage cavity. This particular piece about gas release is somewhat outdated, but I'll get a little bit more into that later. The external fire test, this is something that's more traditionally fire resistance. So if you have an external fire where you have this product included in that space, is there a resistance against that fire basically involving that product and the lithium-ion batteries in it? In the current language, this test is optional, seeing that these two really preventing the batteries from becoming an ignition source is the primary piece that we're trying to get at with this standard. Whereas once the room is flashed over, in many conditions it may not be as substantial, although as Adam had mentioned previously, if there are enough batteries, the flammability of that smoke could change. And then finally, on the sort of additional considerations, we're looking at things like structural loading. These batteries are heavy, so these products have to be able to withstand that mechanical loading over time. If they have automatic door closers, do they close correctly and consistently? And if they're placed outdoors, are they correctly tested to deal with that environmental condition? So in case of the internal thermal runaway test, we did a couple kind of demonstration tests over the past year or so, maybe a little bit more, where we wanted to understand what the hazards were and whether or not they're mitigated by simple storage devices that are in existence, things like cabinets or flammable liquid storage cabinets. And we really found that they didn't, that the storage of batteries inside of these containers does not contain the hazard. You have release of gas, you have external flaming. The conditions of thermal runaway escape that containment. So when we designed the internal thermal runaway test, we were looking at things like external surface temperatures or surface temperatures adjacent to that storage cavity where your fuel package is stored. And when I say storage cavity, it's kind of a general term that the technical committee came up with that says, okay, it could be a cubby, it could be a locker, it could be a shelf. So that was kind of the general term that we came up with. But we wanted to look at items like external flaming, external surface temperatures. If there's a handle where you're moving this thing, for example, moving batteries off of a fire ground, do temperatures on that handle go past a certain level of safety? And then, of course, rupture. Does your door burst open? Are you breaking seams or welds? Are you destroying the structural integrity of the product during thermal runaway? So here is an example of what the internal deflagration test could look like. Again, all still in development, but the idea here was we filled the internal volume of this container with a flammable mixture using a method very similar to what we use for the large-scale explosion tests with the outdoor garage setup. So maybe a little bit underwhelming, but the whole idea being that we have that flammable mixture inside a bag, inside of that space, we ignite it, and then we see the result. So if a product has a properly designed pressure relief, perhaps it could deal with that overpressure. Otherwise, if not, the door could open, and once the door is open, then the subsequent fire from the lithium-ion battery thermal runaway obviously could escape and further exacerbate the situation. So the release of gas was one of the more challenging parts of this, and the approach is still ongoing. But we obviously can't keep the gas completely contained inside of a space. The physics just wouldn't work. Eventually you're producing such high pressures that it's unsustainable. So the gas has to either be directed or released in some way that is manageable. And typically, the best way to reduce the amount of gas is to reduce propagation. The less cells in thermal runaway, the less gas you have to deal with. But generally, one of the first approaches we took is to ask ourselves, how will this eventually look in the codes, in something like the IFC or NFPA, where you're installing and using these in specific conditions. We wanted to more or less have a foundation of that in the use and installation instructions that would be required to be included with these devices. So essentially saying if they're outdoors, they have to be placed in a certain location. Even if they're portable, the instructions clearly say don't bring this indoors, you have to keep it outdoors. If they are indoor use, we took one lesson from the refrigerant industry, which tends to have perhaps not the same, but somewhat related problem of releasing a flammable gas, which in some cases refrigerants can be, something like propane, into a confined space where these refrigeration units would be installed. So the idea is, if you understand how much gas you could release, your volume has to be big enough where you don't generate a flammable mixture. Alternatively, there has to be some form of design feature where you're funneling that gas to a safe external location so you're not accumulating. So in the current draft, this was one of the approaches that we're considering and that will be voted on by the technical committee. So this last slide here kind of showing where we are currently. So it's been a process over the last couple of years. At this point, we're submitting for ballot draft this month, actually probably within the next day or two, at which point the technical committee will vote on the existing language. There may be a few iterations, but it'll then be published as a official UL standard. At which point, products can start to be tested to this standard, at whichever labs are certified to do so. So that's all we have, I believe.
Yeah, now we can roll right into the panel. So Christina and Chris, if you want to join us again. We'll start with Christina. Thank you. Yeah, have a seat. Yep, I think it's just us three for now. Mhm. So I don't think we need to do introductions again, and I'm looking to pass the mic to you because we've been up here forever. So,
what do y'all want to know?
actually, why don't we start this time with questions? We can roll into it from there. I know, George, you had a lot of questions during the last session. I don't know if we answered all your questions, and I also think since we're down to 3, Bob, if you have answers to George's questions, I welcome you to provide those. George, was there a spot you wanted us to pick up where we left off?
I think Bob and I had some No, I think Bob and I had some conversation. You know, I was just kind of brainstorming. You know, there's so much on the fire ground that we have to be aware of. And the threats are ever emerging, and this is just a small element of it, right? And you know, we see these things and trying to make it better and safer for the fire service. Like I kind of mentioned, and maybe Christina has some thoughts from Tesla's you know, experience and their thought process. But something we're seeing right now with our public utilities is that, you know, they are putting in gas detectors that we're getting very quick notifications. And again, we learn from experience. In New York and certainly in other places, you know, we've had buildings detonate because, you know, natural gas was seeping into the buildings and nobody perceived it. Nobody picked up the phone and called us. So now our public utility is putting in these gas detectors. So we're getting now these notifications. And I was at something the other day and they said, I think there's been 2,700 and they have like a 93% rate of that gas is actually present, whether it be the gas that the public service is providing or another flammable, because it's a combustible gas detector. So there is a presence of gas. Maybe it's sewer gas, maybe it's something else, but the fire department is showing up in a timely manner. They now have the ability to remotely cut the power to homes. So maybe that's something that, you know, the industry is looking at. You know, can they safely, remotely isolate these things? Is there something that they could put that maybe would give the first responder community, even in the, you know, in the residential setting, early notification that maybe there's something going on in one of these cells? And just, again, trying to think outside the box, trying to make things safer for the fire service, because, you know, Adam and I kind of spoke, you know, that garage door is a deflagration panel. My biggest concern is my people are going to be standing in front of that deflagration panel. So if there's another way that we could kind of vent it and not have, you know, that significant insult to that door, that whether we like it or not is going to be the focus of our attention, you know, just kind of my thought process.
Perfect. Okay, perfect. There was a lot there. So let me go back to, I think from our approach, we look at, again, that first engineering principle and how do we make a very safe product where we don't rely on any third-party extra detectors or anything like that. Specifically for gas detection, as we aren't, again, a walk-in unit, and I think we talked this just a little bit before, but for our large systems, we are purposely igniting the gas if a propagating event were to occur. So we're going to purposely ignite with a sparker, almost like your propane gas burner that you, or gas grill that you may have, that you try to, you know, wait for it to get to a point where it wants to go. So we're not relying on any detector to open up anything. Any, you know, detectors have a lot of time travel distance, or time to travel, I guess you could say, right? Between the initiating device to alarm panel to object going to tell it to go do something too. And so in our case, for large scale, detection wise, if we have that propagating event where there's enough gas at once to ignite, we are purposely igniting it. So we're a little different than what a lot of manufacturers out there. That's why I said we're not a 68 or 69 system. It's all engineering controlled. So what we're doing when we ignite it, we have a very controlled deflagration with a deflagration panel inside the pack that's going to open up. So if you looked at any of our or ERGs for large scale commercial energy, commercial industrial energy, what you'll see there is that if it's venting, it's done. Like there's absolutely nothing that you need to do to intervene to do anything for just protect exposures that are not pack. So maybe there's a tree nearby or grass or whatever else people can do over time. On the resi side, we actually look at that as we don't purposely ignite resi. So just to a little different concept, right? You don't want to purposely ignite something in a residential environment. For on the residential side, though, our packs, again, that design where they have propagation resistance built into the pack and actually their BMS to keep the event from happening. So in that regards, and I know FSRI has done a lot of work just in general about the type of detectors that may be best for that environment. We are required, though, to, based on our 9540A testing, to do a minimum room size, right? Of how many, like what size do we expect it to reach LFL in? And so when you look at that, you should be able to find out that minimum room size, because on the resi side, you are just going to vent. You're not having a fire per se, because on the testing you do, you have a cheesecloth, so you're not having any external fire from it. So hopefully that helps. And on the resi side though too, you know, there's a required heat alarm right now, but to get a resi system to have a heat alarm go off, you would have to have some type of fire. So that's kind of, I would, and Bob probably knows more about this, but my understanding is that heat alarm required in the garage, which really any resi ESS right now, the heat alarm is the only thing that triggers that. For most codes, you may have some local codes difference, but when that happens, that's there in case there was an event from anybody's resi ESS that you would actually be able to interconnect that then to the occupants and have them evacuate.
I'll jump in on that too, and tie that to. Am I not on? Okay, all right. So I'll tie that to some discussions we've had in one of the ICC gap analysis groups, which is we have looked at whether there should be requirements. It's been proposed that there should be requirements for manufacturers to install sensors in their products to start detecting pre-thermal runaway conditions or thermal runaway conditions. That'd be good for the homeowner. That one test I showed where the garage filled full of flammable gas, I think a point that I missed on that in my haste to get through the slides is all that gas built up, but it's thermal runaway generates a lot of heat in the cells, but relative to the size of a fire, it's not a lot of heat. So that garage only got about 2 to 3 degrees Celsius warmer. So, 5, 6 degrees Fahrenheit, whatever. Not enough to set off a heat detector. So a heat detector would not have seen that scenario coming. If we start looking at, Christina mentioned the other sensors we've looked at in the commercial energy storage research we were doing. We looked at off-the-shelf sensors, and basically when you look at those in terms of a garage installation, well, a hydrogen detector is going to go off because it's cross-sensitive to CO when you pull your car in the garage. Smoke detectors are going to go off when you're doing any hobby in your garage. VOC detectors are going to go off because of the two-stroke gas, the gasoline, whatever, all the stuff I have stored in my garage. So most of the common available approaches aren't very good. So it puts some pressure to sort of suggest manufacturers start including something in their construction, which to all of us, myself included, seems like it should be easy and the responsible thing to do. We're not at the point where we know what the response is going to be yet. But I'm gonna pivot off that and end up handing it over to Ben for any further comments. But our data shows that the ESS failure rate's not very high right now. As more manufacturers get into the game and we have more installations, that might change. But the clear and present problem really for home occupants, mostly in urban areas, but getting to be out in suburbia too, is the failure of those micromobility devices. And I'm thinking specifically of 80 Madison Street, where apartments above a e-bike repair shop, repairs that should not have been being done in New York City under New York City rules, led to now whether it's gases from the batteries coming out or the fact that it was just a fast developing fire, led to the fatalities of 4 people above the fire. No fire extension to that floor. They all succumbed to smoke. So that's all just from unregulated products. Now, I will point to a challenge with UL 1487, which is those cabinets are a fantastic idea, but we can't take a flammable liquid storage cabinet and paint it from yellow to, or red to green or blue and say, now it's battery cabinets. That won't work. Ben showed an example of that, and they can't contain the gas. So how they get installed is everything to keep that gas from coming out and preventing or presenting exposure hazards to people. Ben did show, how you can reduce the amount of gas, and I'll leave him, something to talk about. But that's a significant concern, as well as the versions that are marketed towards first responders, which may provide some benefit. But if you look at there's a video from a gentleman steps in an elevator in Singapore with an e-bike. If that battery was in a case that can't contain its gas, it doesn't matter if it's in the case or not. In that elevator, that's a fatal. So even though we have all these layers we're developing, we still have some real significant challenges, and some of them are at the forefront and presenting a greater risk than even, energy storage system rollouts, which is kind of where the hype is. So let me turn it over to Ben.
Life expectancy of your batteries, whether it be a vehicle battery or your ESS systems?
Great question. I don't know that off the top of my head, but I think it's tens of decades. Sorry, that's a bad answer. But I can get that for you and send it to Sean to send out to the group. But it's 20 plus years. I know
just
that,
in the fire service, we look at certain types of structures and their life expectancy, and now if we're adding a thermal insult to them, I just don't know that we have much of a perspective
Right.
of the failures of
So-
these.
Yeah, no, I wanted to just give, when we talked about statistics, I do want to just say, so again, we have about 600,000 power walls installed globally, and we've only had one that's had a thermal event. That was just a very strange scenario, and it didn't even start in the battery. And so statistics, when Adam was saying low for ESS, at Tesla we have our own low statistics for that. And we've also had a number of those in case studies where a full structure garage has happened where the power wall never went into runaway. Doesn't mean that it will never happen. And all this would be excluding whatever the findings from Maui. So let's take that into play there as an unusual scenario. But we do monitor everything. And again, we try to look at not having extra intervention. So the system itself is smart, so it knows what to do when certain things come in. And as we continue to learn with all the signals we monitor, it can get to a point where it'll shut itself down, notify the homeowner to call us, and then they talk through it. So that I think that adds to our statistics that we have too.
All right, Ben, then we'll go to Chris.
Sure. So I guess going back a little bit to what Adam had mentioned on the e-mobility front, and then the products that are kind of appearing in the market to address the thermal runaway hazard. I mean, as Adam had mentioned this also regarding the EV world, where it's a great time to be in business to come up with strategies, right? Some product, some device to achieve some form of firefighting or fire safety effectiveness against this hazard. In the case of 1487, the containment products were the products that came to UL, multiple different manufacturers saying we'd like to have these certified. That type of product was one of the first ones that we saw. And now we see a wide variety of these sorts of products, but not necessarily all of them may be within the 1487, I guess, scope, if you will. The gas release part and the installation part is one of the most challenging parts for sure, because to have that gas release in many cases of thermal runaway is an inevitability, and as far as reducing the amount, one of the primary ways really is reducing that propagation. So if you imagine you have a cabinet where you would store 50 drill batteries, your propagation risk is higher than if you have, say, 20 lockers where you have 2 or 3 drill batteries in each of them. You know, your total amount of gas release potential is lower, assuming that you have good separation and good fire protection measures between those storage locations. As far as the products that we're seeing, there are somewhat of a range. If you go on Amazon and if you look up something like, for example, an e-bike bag, right, an e-bike battery bag or e-mobility bag, there are dozens of these products that you can scroll through that are anywhere from $20 to $30 that are designed for carrying your battery. And typically there'll be some form of video where they have a piece of paper they light on fire, they throw it in the bag, and voila. But of course, you know, challenging such a product with lithium-ion battery with a lithium-ion battery fuel package is a different story altogether. It's a different animal. So we expect that the products that would be used in a 1487 capacity would be substantially more robust. But as that testing program starts to evolve is when we're going to start to learn more. Because as ESS evolves very quickly and the potential differences and the potential variations, the bells, the whistles are very high, these products are somewhat of the same. Some of them may have some form of water injection system or maybe a clean agent, some form of an integral system if you want to call it that. Some of them may be very, very simple, just a box that is very beefy. So how the testing evolves is yet to be seen, and what products are successful is yet to be seen. But you know, UL is excited to see where that goes.
Thank you. Look, you want one more? Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so I may have missed this in your presentation, so please forgive me. On these cabinets, so thinking of the flammable liquid cabinet where we have the bung, which for decades was, do you take it out? Do you put it in? Do you pipe it out? it has to go outside the building, inside. Where does it go? Will there be something like that in these cabinets for explosion relief?
No, that's a very fair question. I mean, we, at UL can't say design it this way, right? We can't. But one of the realistic means of dealing with these sorts of hazards is, yes, the gas will have to be either directed somewhere, or the installation will have to be such that the potential release of gas from that product is below a certain volume, where the volume of the room you're in does not develop a substantial explosive mixture. And all of that currently is written into essentially installation instructions within the standard, as kind of a foundational piece of what we think the installation codes could look like, because a product safety standard can't be a code. There is an inherent separation between the two. So, but for now, that's our approach.
Yes.
All right, just to change gears, take some of the heat off these guys. Woo. So a different approach, kind of same topic. Paul Rogers had mentioned earlier, the correlation that we have with NFPA 241 and tying it into, energy storage and how it looks like that. But both right now, and you're going to get a better dive into this tomorrow. The session here, we'll go over the NFPA process and how do you do submittals and stuff like that. But to jump forward, currently right now, both NFPA 241 and NFPA 88A. 241 is for safeguarding construction, alteration, and demolition, and 88A is for parking garages, not including the 1 and 2 family. But they're both in session, and they both have public input dates for June 4th. So you got just under a month. They're both looking at batteries, containment, and sprinkler protection, whether it's prescribed or performance-based. So it's kind of, for different captures, but they're both looking at that, whether it's for overall protection or what's dealing with the batteries. They're both looking at components of that. Both identically, crazy enough, both have 18 task groups between the two, all in different areas, but it's just funny. They both worked out there's 18 different task groups between both committees. And in that, sprinkler coverage, overseeing battery protection and cabinets and stuff like that, whether for the tool batteries, whether it's for permanent storage, and all that is all being looked at. So where I'm going with that is, now's your chance to, if you're savvy into that, or we can certainly talk offline, but now's your chance to put in a public input, because at least you have a placeholder, because you have to do it now. And again, I don't want to take David's thunder away on what he explains tomorrow, but there's a process to do it for a cycle, and this is where it starts. And if you don't do it now, it can't, as long as you get it in now, there's, in Bob Davidson's words, there's other bites at the apple that can be taking place once you get something started. But if you miss this, you can't pick it up later on. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that there's all kinds of approaches, and it's funny how the whole world has all been, I don't want to say shifting, but it's all working around these topics. So thank you.
Well, and I appreciate that, Chris, and I don't want to see you getting too comfortable up here, so I'd like to change the topic to one, it's an East Coast issue for now. I think it's specific also to the Northeast, and I know you've been passionate about car stackers. So if you'd introduce that topic to the audience and your concerns with that, adding EVs to the mix, I don't think we've talked about it. I think we should address that today.
All right, this is a huge change of gears. So, but fortunately, it's still IAFF interest. So through Director DeCrane, he's allowed me to represent this wonderful organization on the A17 elevator code standards. So I'm now a representative of the emergency operations. How I got there, though, is locally here. I'm a governor appointed through the Department of Fire Services. That's what it's known here in Massachusetts, the State Fire Marshal's office. Through the State Fire Marshal, I'm his representative on the State Elevator Board. And with that, I've been on that board now for the last 3 years. And what I learned real quick is that Massachusetts elevator regulations oversees automated parking puzzling systems, in which there's 3 essential classes. Massachusetts gives them classes, but on 88A, they're known as stackers, simple stackers. They're known as mechanical, kind of that semi-automated fashion, or the fully automated. And through my learnings, and again, speaking for myself, my opinions, but through my learnings over the last 3 years, I'm like, wow, what a world that's out there in this, that nobody's overseeing them. So I actually, when we were in Raleigh, I actually had a conversation with, what was her name? With Alex from UL, saying, hey, maybe we should have a conversation at some point and talk to see if there's something that could be done. Because right now there's, I don't want to say they're running rogue and they're not regular. Like there's electrical components there is, and there's some stuff we see in the elevator side of it. But as far as sprinkler protection, on a stacker, how does that get designed in? If the vehicle above is on its pallet and it's casting a shadow, creating a cloud in the NFPA 13 world, how does water get delivered need to go? So now we're looking at, maybe sidewalls, but what's the design criteria? NFPA 13 is not exactly covering that. There's some stuff, in garages, holistically, the 13's done is change categories from hazard 1 to hazard 2. But ironically enough, in the 88A world, we're actually having one of these task groups, and Christina's on it with me. We're having a deep dive discussion on what that looks like for sprinkler protection, and it's looking at doing some stuff with performance-based, what you can do right out the chute, and doing some stuff, prescriptive, and then diving into performance-based, and to see what, how that's going to work. And then with that, you're getting into now the deeper dive on spotting and locating car charges, the electric vehicles, should they go here? Should they be located where it's convenient for fire department access? However, does that have some impact if there's a mishap? Does it, compromise egress? So we're having many task group meetings and discussions going over what that might look like. So I hope I hit the mark that you were asking at. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Well, I appreciate that, Chris. Thank you. I think another thing that's important is to understand where we're at with fire protection systems in parking garages relative to concerns around electric vehicles. Obviously, if we haven't figured that out, car stackers are going to be vastly more complicated version of that same thing. I know you're on the NFPA 88 Technical Committee, Christina. I don't know if you wanted to introduce what's going on with 88A and sprinklers.
Perfect. So I did get to sit on 88A with Chris here, partner in crime, so to speak. Now 88A, as you know, recently in their latest revision required sprinklers in all garages. They removed all the exceptions of when it was an open garage. So even an open garage now, regardless of what type of car is in there, is a sprinklered garage. Realizing that that's not going to be the case for all garages out there, especially the legacy type systems, but for new, 88A is all sprinklered. Now that comes to the question, when you go to 88A, it says to get your sprinkler design from NFPA 13. So NFPA 13 being the sprinkler standard does not give very specific data for or split anything up for the type of automobile in that garage. There is a research project going on with the NFPA Research Foundation where they did phase 1 already about the modern parking garage. And if you haven't read that report, I would highly recommend it. It was a great literature review of existing and major garage losses over time. And so they went through and looked at all those and looked at all the test data. Again, as Adam says, most of the ICE test data that we had out there, so ICE being internal combustion engine, is from older legacy type data. And now they're looking at, they tried to pull in all the existing data that they could find with a newer modern car. They have a great review of modern versus legacy cars in general, their weight, their plastic weight increase, and all the above. So with that being said, the question becomes what type of sprinkler density is needed for any car, not just an EV. So the Research Foundation in this next phase is doing suppression testing for garages for EVs, and we are part of or we plan to be part of that test program, and that will be able to give some type of guidance, see what's really different, similar to what Adam showed you on their tech panel, on their panel was how do they burn? What are the heat release rates? This is going to add suppression to just the parking garage look. And all the data to date doesn't show really just a difference from it. As we know, the battery may take longer, but it's not necessarily hotter or higher heat release rate. And there's a bunch of European data and from Asia right now and test reports on that. So that's what we're looking to do. Some folks have started to add in their local requirements information, even going to an extra hazard group too whenever you have EV charging, because and when I ask them this, one person said it's because the event's going to last longer. But we have to remember, as a fire community, that's not how we design sprinkler systems. The event lasting longer is a response and water supply. It's not how much water we put on it initially. So that's where we are. One of the things too that we're looking at as a code committee, which you all I think would be great to listen in and add some thoughts to, is, as we know with e-mobility, if there is a plug, there will probably be something charging. So one of the things that we're looking at is, where do we want e-mobility charging in parking decks? As things change, you probably will see more scooters, golf carts, e-bikes, all the above. When someone has a parking garage, what does that look like? So that's one of the things we're trying to look at now, is like, where do we put those? Do we stairwells? I'm not at the electrical code, but stairwells still require some outlets, I believe, in some cases. And so, like, where would that be? Is it outside the stairwells, means of egress, that type of stuff? So, so that's what's happening. It's a fun code to be on. You should join us.
And it actually reminded me that I had a point I missed as well. There just wasn't enough time, essentially, in the presentation to cover it. But with respect to EV suppression and what we learned from our joint exercise with Boston Fire Department up on Moon Island, it's a fairly unscientific setting. We were able to set the car on fire. We couldn't take a lot of measurements like we can in our laboratory, but we wanted to try some basic things out. And so these aren't, I would not confuse these with recommendations, but when I mention that what we're trying to find is an understanding between let it burn and copious amounts of water, was we tried an approach where essentially we filled the bathtub, treating the cabin as the bathtub. Some of that data I showed you showed that other than when the gas tank was failing and letting the gas out and that was on fire, most of the fire came from the cabin fire materials. So if you're in a situation where you've got to control the exposures, why not knock down that cabin fire? And what we've seen through some of our testing so far is some of these vehicles have it's probably going to go by the wayside, but they have a service disconnect inside the vehicle. The Chevy Bolt, the Hyundai Ioniq are a couple examples where you're not really supposed to take it out, but if you swing a handle up and pull on it, there's a penetration through the body tub into the battery pack. When we burned that Hyundai Kona in Boston, we saw that melted and failed and became a path for water to go from the inside of the cabin inside that battery. The car maker Renault in France has designed a port to do that on purpose, and other manufacturers, Ford was one, that kind of inexplicably has some holes in the footwells. I'm not sure what they're for running wires or something, but those melted out. And on top of that, the composite battery pack top sort of gave way. Is resin and fiberglass, gave way, and basically allowed us to get water from the inside of the vehicle down into the pack. So if you're controlling your maximum fire size, then you're just dealing with this battery fire. And what we did just up the street at Moon Island was use some undercar nozzles to control. We did have some jets coming out, and at that point we could decide whether we wanted to turn those jets on and off. Essentially, we couldn't stop the jetting, but we could decide if we wanted it to burn or not by just putting a nozzle into it or taking it back out. So then you got to consider, are you in a parking garage where that gas can build up, or are you having that jet hit something you don't want to burn? So we saw there are options available. That door is open. That's why we're taking that approach. But again, all that's going to be very heavily construction dependent. It's just a little bit smarter approach as to why do we have to do it this with this limited number of options. We have about 15 minutes left. More questions from the audience. We've been going. Bob's got one. Got some.
So, the issue of volume of space versus amount of gas that's being generated. And I know it's in the standard for the 812s. I know it's a 9540. But on a task group last week for 9540, we discussed the issue that it's problematic. And it's problematic for two reasons. One is it's making an assumption that the gas released is dissipating equally throughout the room and staying below 25%. And we know that doesn't happen, right? Based on physics, right? Engineering, we know it doesn't happen. We have videos of these events and pooling at low, pooling high, and we're getting deflagrations, right? Because it's not doing that, right? The other problem is it's based on the room at the time of installation, all right? The minute the installation is done, you don't know what's in that room. The average homeowner fills it. Think of the garage. It may be nice and empty, right, at the time of the installation of an ESS, but come back a year, come back in 2 years, come back in 3 years, what happened to all its space, right? So we had a very frank discussion of that being in there actually being unrealistic. Is that it's not based on the science of how the gas dissipates, but it's also not practical because you can't guarantee that space is there for the life of the installation.
I'll jump into that one and see if anyone else has any comments on it too. But that is a common denominator problem that is not limited to even batteries. So the appliance industry, the HVAC industry, has run into that same challenge as we've gone to low flammability refrigerants and as we transition towards A3s like propane. They have embraced an approach that it's essentially a more honest and more well-developed engineering around it, same limitations. So I know that they have sponsored through UL and other organizations research to look at if this refrigerant charge fails and leaks into a room, under what scenarios does it become flammable and what are those consequences? That's very serious. I haven't really seen the battery industry do that yet. That is why Ben and some others and I ran the test we ran. And you're exactly right. It doesn't have to fill the room to become an explosion hazard. But they're across refrigerants and where you put UL 1487 cabinets and where you put energy storage systems of unknown quality. This is a common issue because even if we stick a sticker on it that says the room you put this in has to be bigger than 10 by 10 by 8, who is it the homeowner that's going to look at that? If it's residential, is there any fire marshal that's even going to have anything to do with enforcing that? It's a common issue, and frankly, I keep hammering it on the product side, but I'm not sure where we can really go with it. So I hate to leave it there, but that's where I'm running into a wall myself.
Thank you. I wanted to build on something George brought up earlier about how we construct attached garages. So we've been wrestling with what is essentially less than 20 kilowatt hour energy storage systems, while at the same time the cars are sitting there with 80 or 120 kilowatt hours in them, maybe 2 or 3 EVs. Your conventional fueled vehicles have plastic fuel tanks, 96% of them now, 2-minute burn time once exposed to fire, and that immediate heat release we know exceeds what we're getting out of an ESS. So with the ICC ad hoc battery committee, the topic came up under the residential subtask group, which is Sean is actually chair of. Somebody said maybe it's about time we step back and look at how we build attached garages, right? Because let's face it, what's in the code now is heavily industry influenced. And in the IRC, it's put up half-inch gypsum board, pack the cracks and you're good to go. Put the door on with a return on it, right? You're good to go. And that's it. Now, I will tell you that when we developed 855 Chapter 15, which everything we have residential is based on right now, Tesla actually stepped up and did a burn test of a mock-up room, right, with the half-inch gypsum board and thermocouple both sides and everything, and documented that, well, with the less than 20 kilowatt hours, that half-inch gypsum board actually works, functions. But the problem we had when we started looking at it is we're ignoring everything else that's already in the garage. That We need to step back and look at the total hazards and the fuel load that's sitting there, and maybe it's time to look at how we construct them. And actually, the person who brought that up actually is a consultant to the home building industry, so maybe we'll actually get something out of it this time.
Do you want to comment? Okay, other questions? Bob, more? Anybody? Anybody? What else we got? Okay, sir, over here.
So I have one more question. You all, I've been through all kinds of meetings when they've gone to do field testing. And my question is, and there are nerdles out there, and I caught Bob's drift, how do they get trained to do the testing that you guys develop? Is there any training for them, or do they just get the standard and say, here you go, you got to test to that? That's been always on my mind because, again, there are so many different people that come out to do field examinations that, and I'm right with Bob, so that's my question. Is there any training for those other nerdles when they get to do this testing?
I feel like you're putting me on the spot with a diplomatic response to that one. We had offered training after developing 9548 that was basically open to anybody. And so that was some of the training I referred you to earlier. So some of our public presentations at NFPA annual conference were all available, and that was basically to get people to where you should be able to understand what you're looking at in terms of the data. What we had to do to develop that standard, to even get to that level of competence, essentially was Ben and some others, myself, had to run a bunch of basically practice tests leading up to a very large commercial system we tested. That manufacturer was kind of brave and jumped in with us and ran it first. There were things we decided from that should be done better, so we wrote the standard around all of those experiences. If someone does not have that experience, essentially what they have to do is either repeat their own R&D internally or have those energy storage system manufacturers come to them and say, I know this is going to be R&D data before it's going to be UL 9548 data, but I'm in the not-for-profit now, but when I was on the for-profit side with Ben, essentially we were doing as best as we could, but a lot of that effectively is intellectual property and gives UL the advantage in being the one to develop the standard. We will help out wherever we can, but competency is not consistent across the board, and you may have seen that. Okay, any other questions, or maybe we break 5 minutes early? Okay, Christina's got a flight to catch, and I'm sure you guys are getting tired of Ben and I. And you can catch Chris anytime. He's local. I forget on which side of the river it's the correct one, but he's on that one. So, yeah. So thank you all very much. Turn it back to Phil if you have any final closing comments or whatever's next.
No, I just want to thank all of our presenters today for the time coming out here.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the local and national for having us here to share our material, and everyone have a good night.
So I know it's been a long day, but if you guys want to stick around, we have some pizzas coming. If you want to stick around, have a drink, network, talk with some of these people. I know there's a lot of questions, but again, we bring these subject matter experts to help you answer questions and so forth. So please stick around if you can, and we're back at it tomorrow. Again, 9 o'clock, and with a big focus on our PPE, cleaning, and a lot of talk about the new standards coming out. Right? Thank you.